The torn flounce had 17 stitches left. Hesper Whitgrove sat at the window of the downstairs sitting room in the grey wash of a London dawn, the needle moving with the quiet discipline of long practice. And she did not hear the carriage pulling up outside, because no one troubled to tell her when the world was about to arrive. That was the nature of her position. News reached the Dowager's companion when it was no longer news. Carriages were noticed by footmen and housemaids, not by the woman who sat mending in the window and was, to all practical purposes, part of the furniture. The flounce belonged to one of the Dowager's evening gowns, silver-grey watered silk, heavy and old-fashioned, cut in a style that had not been fashionable for 15 years and was, by that very fact, beginning to seem distinguished again. The Dowager Duchess of Kelvinridge did not follow fashion. She predated it. At 80 years old, she was sharp as splintered bone, with the particular authority that comes not from rank alone, but from outliving everyone who had ever tried to diminish her. She had buried a husband, 2 sons, and 3 decades of her own grief. And she moved through her mornings with the brisk efficiency of someone who had long since stopped performing patience for anyone else's benefit. The morning room reflected her exactly. Good fire, no excess. A small writing desk against the far wall, covered in correspondence that she answered herself, in a hand so precise it looked engraved. The chocolate tray went cold on the side table most mornings, because she was already writing before it was brought in. It was into this room, fire-lit, curtains still half drawn against the damp cold of early March, a faint smell of coal smoke and old leather mixing with the spiced warmth of the chocolate, that Mrs. Feld arrived. She swept in without adequate preamble, the silk of her visiting dress rustling with an energy that suggested she had walked very fast from her carriage, or had at least wanted to give that impression. Mrs. Feld was a woman who prided herself, above all other qualities, on being first. First with a name, first with a date, first with a piece of intelligence that the rest of the drawing rooms of Mayfair were still fitting together. She deposited herself into the chair opposite the Dowager with a rustle and a small, satisfied exhalation, and announced, as though presenting a gift of considerable value, that the Duke of Kelvinridge would be in town within a fortnight. The Dowager listened with the expression she reserved for information she already possessed. The Duke, her grandson Everett, would be opening the great house in Berkeley Square. The housekeeper had been sent ahead. The furniture covers had been removed, the cellars were being restocked. And every mother in England, Mrs. Feld declared with unconcealed relish, was already sharpening her arrows. In the window, barely visible behind the curtain's edge, Hesper finished the 17th stitch, turned the flounce over to check the tension, and said nothing. It was not her place to have opinions about the Duke. She was 26, and her situation was this. Her father, a gentleman in Wiltshire with a moderate estate and an immoderate faith in his own financial judgment, had died 4 years ago and left behind him a tangle of debts so artfully constructed that by the time the solicitors had finished with the estate, there was not enough remaining to bury him decently. Hesper had sold her mother's pearl earrings, small, matched, the last thing her mother had pressed into her hands, to cover that cost. She had sold the household silver to cover the rest. Then she had packed a single trunk, accepted the position as companion to the Dowager Duchess of Kelvinridge for a salary that was modest even by the modest standards of the profession, and she had been here ever since. The trunk still held the pearl earrings' empty velvet case. She had not thrown it away. She was not certain why. She had not expected to love the old woman. That had been an accident, a slow, reluctant accident, the kind that announces itself only in hindsight when it has already become a fact. The Dowager was difficult, exacting, and entirely disinterested in being comforted. She was also, beneath that, capable of a dry and precise kindness that Hesper had learned to recognise and value more than any softer version would have been worth. When Mrs. Feld finally departed, still vibrating with the pleasure of having been first, the dowager set down her cup and looked at Hesper with the directness she applied to everything. "He will be hunted," she said without ceremony. Hesper set the mended flounce aside. "Yes, ma'am. He has not always been cold." She said it the way she said things she had considered carefully. Flatly, as though the sentiment in the statement were no one's business, least of all the statement's own. When his brother was alive, Everett was... he was something other than what he is now. Marcus died in the autumn before last, and the title came down on him like a roof collapsing. He was the clever younger brother, you understand, the one nobody troubled about, because Marcus was steady. And Marcus was the heir, and there was no need for Everett to be anything in particular except himself. She paused, looking at some middle distance that did not contain the morning room. He has not yet had time to discover what he might have been. Hesper listened. She filed it away with the careful discretion that had kept her employed. She did not think she would ever be in a room with the Duke of Kelvinridge, and she was reasonably certain that if she were, he would not see her. Men with titles, and all London watching them, did not see women who mended flounces in windows. She was, she had decided long ago, quite comfortable being unseen. The 10 days that followed were quiet, full of the small machinery of a life that had learned to take up very little space. Mornings over the newspapers, the dowager's correspondence, which required a particular kind of neat penmanship and a perfect insensibility to other people's private affairs. Afternoons, running errands through the grey-stoned streets. The circulating library on Bond Street was Hesper's one permitted luxury. She was allowed 1 volume per fortnight, chosen for herself, and she chose with the seriousness of someone to whom it genuinely mattered. The volume she carried home that particular fortnight was a history of the great English country houses of the previous century. Dense with architectural detail, its engravings showing interiors that no longer existed in the forms depicted. Rooms remade or demolished, or simply emptied of the lives that had given them their names. She read it late, after the dowager was settled, by a candle that she kept burning a little longer than she was strictly entitled to. The linen draper on Oxford Street, the haberdashers on St. James's, the milliners for new cap ribbons. Hesper moved through the city's commercial life like a steady current, unremarkable and purposeful, entirely at home in her own invisibility. She had made a peace with it. She had folded her wants away like the clothes of someone who had gone and would not return, neatly, without sentiment, put at the back of the drawer. This was not unhappiness, precisely. It was simply the shape her life had taken, and she had learned to inhabit that shape rather than exhaust herself against its edges. On the 10th day, the dowager announced they would attend Lady Southerton's musicale. It was her first public appearance of the season, and the entire household received this intelligence with a particular alertness. Phelps, the lady's maid, a woman of middle age and extraordinary composure, who had been dressing the dowager for 22 years and considered it a vocation, began a quiet campaign of pressing and inspection that occupied most of the afternoon. Hesper was informed she would attend, and that she would wear the grey silk. Not the good grey, the dowager added, with a faint and not unkind precision. The other one. Hesper examined the other one. Dove-grey silk, softly faded at the shoulders, made over twice already, decent but clearly not new. It had, she thought, the look of a thing that had once been somebody's good dress, and had since become somebody else's sensible dress, which was perhaps a fair description of how she herself had arrived at her current situation. She put it on without remark and took up the dowager's ivory-handled fan, the small vinaigrette of chased silver that travelled everywhere in the dowager's reticule, and, as always, the old woman's opinions, which required no physical receptacle, but considerable mental preparation. Lady Southerton's rooms were a crush. Even in early March, even in the thin shoulder of the season, the prospect of the new Duke of Kelvinridge appearing at a musicale was sufficient to fill a house past its comfortable capacity. The air inside was close with candle heat and too many competing perfumes, the wax from the chandeliers thinning the scent of powder and pomade into something almost sweet. Hesper found her position near a pillar, draped in a swag of evergreen that still exhaled faintly of December, and watched. She was very good at watching. Years of practice had given her a stillness that was sometimes mistaken for shyness, but was in fact something different, a quality of quiet attention, of absorbing without participating, of being present without claiming space. He entered late. Tall, with the ease of movement that belongs to men who have never been physically uncertain of themselves. Not arrogance, exactly, but the body's settled knowledge of its own dimensions. His hair was dark auburn, lit warm under the chandeliers. His face was hard and handsome, in the way of a thing shaped by weather rather than comfort. And his eyes, when they swept the room in that first survey, were a grey like the sea in March. Not hostile, but the colour of something that had not yet determined whether to be welcoming. He looked, above everything else, besieged. Tired to the bone of something, though the tiredness was held so firmly in check that only the eyes showed it, and only if you were watching from somewhere he had not thought to look. The hunt began immediately. Mothers corrected trajectories, daughters were steered with invisible pressure, arriving at his vicinity as though by accident of the crowd. A woman of formidable brow and greater determination manoeuvred a daughter of 18, pretty, frightened, wearing silk the colour of a blush and a smile held in place by sheer determined will, directly into his path near the third window. The Duke listened to the introduction with a stillness like a shut door. He answered in monosyllables. He never once looked at the girl, though he addressed her with formal correctness. His gaze fixed at a point slightly above her head, with the practiced unseeing of a man who had been performing this particular courtesy long enough to perfect it. When the mother finally steered her daughter away, she wore the expression of a woman revising her tactics rather than conceding them. Lady Genevieve Carstairs was another matter entirely. She was beautiful in the thoroughgoing way that requires not merely good features, but the confidence to deploy them with precision. And she had refined her approach to the science of the ballroom, until it bore no resemblance to effort. She did not steer. She positioned herself within the natural current of the room, at a point where the Duke must pass if he moved toward the refreshment table. And she received his arrival as though she had not anticipated it, by 20 careful minutes of repositioning. When he paused, and he did pause, for she was impossible not to pause for, she gave him only a cool inclination of her head, the smallest acknowledgement possible, and let him go. She appeared, entirely convincingly, not to want him. Hesper recognised it as the most dangerous manoeuvre in the room. She fetched lemonade from the table for the dowager, accepted a brief satirical remark from the old woman about the calibre of Lady Southerton's pianist, and returned to her position near the pillar. She had no particular feelings about the Duke. He was a man in the middle of a situation she understood well enough in outline. Too much scrutiny, too many purposes directed at him, no comfortable place to rest. But it was not her situation, and he was not her concern, and she did not trouble herself with concerns she had no part in. She was not looking at him. This, apparently, was what he noticed. She became aware of it at some point during the second piece, a competent if uninspired Mozart sonata, as a change in the quality of the room, a small adjustment in the weight of her own position in it. She did not turn to confirm the feeling. She continued watching the pianist's hands, the management of the pedal, the way the candlelight moved in long stripes across the ivory keys. After the music, she helped the dowager with her wrap. located a dropped glove beneath the velvet bench where it had slipped, and when she straightened with it, the Duke was speaking with his grandmother in the doorway. He had his back half turned to the room. The Dowager was answering some question with the brevity she employed when she intended to give away exactly as much as she chose and not a syllable more. Later, much later, much later, when Hesper had more reason than she wanted to revisit the evening in careful detail, she would locate the precise moment her invisibility in London ended. It was not the Duke's first glance across the room. It was the second one, 10 minutes after the music finished, when he spoke to his grandmother in the doorway, and she watched him receive the answer to whatever question he had asked, with the particular stillness of a man who has just been told something that interests him more than he expected. Then he crossed the room. He did not drift or allow himself to be steered. He moved with the directness of a man who had decided to do a thing and saw no argument for doing it circuitously. The room noticed. Hesper was aware of it before she was fully aware of him approaching. A subtle shift in the temperature of nearby conversations. A few glances that told the story of his trajectory before she had tracked it herself. He stopped in front of her. Up close, the weary distaste she had observed from across the room resolved into something more specific. Not contempt for the company exactly, but the expression of a man who has been performing himself for too many hours and is running short of the energy required. "Why did you not look at me?" he said. There was nothing in his tone that required delicacy in the answering. It was a genuine question, asked as though he expected a genuine answer, and Hesper gave him one. "You were already much looked at," she said, "and I was occupied with Lady Kelvinridge's fan." She held it up, slightly, as evidence. The ivory-handled one, carved in a pattern of crossed reeds, which she had been holding in both hands while watching the pianist. He looked at it with an expression she could not quite classify. "That is the most useful answer I have received this evening," he said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite, but the structural possibility of one. He said it had been a novel sensation, not being looked at, and that he had been missing it without being able to name what he was missing. His voice when he said it was not warm. Warmth would have made it something else, something performative. It was simply true, said plainly. And then he inclined his head with the clean precision of a formal farewell and moved away. Hesper watched him go, the way she watched everything, taking the full inventory and keeping it to herself. From the far end of the room, Lady Genevieve had watched the entire exchange with the particular quality of stillness that is not calm at all, but its exact opposite, made to look like calm. Her gaze stayed on Hesper a few seconds longer than politeness required. Then she turned back to her companions with a smile that gave nothing away, and began to think. The ball to open the Kelvinridge house in Berkeley Square was announced for the 23rd, which gave London a fortnight to prepare its ambitions. In those 14 days, the drawing rooms of Mayfair processed the intelligence from Lady Southerton's musicale with the efficiency of machinery well maintained by frequent use. Every mother who had watched the Duke cross that room now recalibrated. Every daughter who had not been Hesper Whitgrove tried to identify precisely what it was about Hesper Whitgrove that had produced the crossing. The answers were varied and largely wrong. Nobody seriously considered the true one, which was that she had not tried. Hesper, meanwhile, was sent 3 days before the ball to confer with Mrs. Hadlow, the Kelvinridge housekeeper, regarding the Dowager's preferred seating at supper and the particular draught that troubled her near any east-facing window. The house in Berkeley Square had been shut for 14 months and carried the particular atmosphere of a place that had been properly maintained but not inhabited. Every surface clean, every candlestick polished, every chair in its assigned position, and the whole of it breathless as a held note, waiting for the specific disarrangement that only people living in it could provide. Mrs. Hadlow was a compact, capable woman in her 50s, with silver hair pinned in a style that did not waste effort on decoration, and she received Hesper in the housekeeper's room with a tray of tea and the air of someone who had her own opinions about the week ahead. "The Berkeley Square house," Mrs. Hadlow said, pouring with the efficiency of long practice, "has not been happy at large gatherings in my experience. The gallery echoes, the supper room overheats, but we shall manage." Hesper accepted her tea and made her notes, and found herself looking, on the way out, through the half-open library door at the end of the ground-floor corridor. The room beyond was long and dark-panelled, book-lined to the ceiling on 3 walls, with 2 deep leather armchairs positioned near the fireplace at an angle suggesting they had been placed there by someone who understood the proper relationship between a fire, a chair, and an hour's quiet. She did not go in. She filed the room away in the part of her mind that kept information without purpose. On the night of the ball, the house in Berkeley Square was transformed by the full application of candles, flowers, and 120 guests into something entirely different from the house she had catalogued 3 days prior. The gallery was lit end to end. The gallery did, as Mrs. Hadlow had predicted, echo, though the music filled it sufficiently to disguise the fact. The dowager arrived in the silver-grey silk, now repaired beyond any indication of its recent distress, and was immediately claimed by 2 women of equivalent age and force of character, which freed Hesper to perform her secondary function, to exist quietly at the edge of things, available when needed, present but not requiring entertainment. An hour in, the dowager, whose joints by late evening required a particular kind of chair not available in the gallery, sent Hesper to the library at the end of the ground-floor corridor, where a footman had been dispatched to arrange the small chaise that travelled with the dowager to parties where the seating was uncertain. The footman had done his work, left the fire banked and burning, and departed. The library was warm and almost silent. After the packed heat of the gallery, it was, there is no other word, a relief. Hesper sat in one of the leather armchairs, intending to wait only until she was wanted. On the table beside the chair, someone had left a copy of Cooper's poems, a small octavo volume, the spine faded to a grey that matched the boards, and she opened it without particular intent, reading the first poem she found, and then the second. And then she was not intending anymore, only reading. And then she was not reading either. She woke because someone said her name. Not loudly. Once, clearly, in a voice she recognised by its register before she was fully awake. She straightened in the chair, the Cooper volume sliding from her lap to the floor, with a sound she would remember later as oddly loud for such a small book. And the Duke of Kelvinridge was standing in the doorway of the library, with the door half open at his back, and an expression on his face she had not seen there before. The sharp, working expression of a man calculating rapidly under pressure. "Miss Whitgrove." He stepped inside and pulled the door nearly shut behind him. "I require your attention for approximately the next 2 minutes." Hesper was awake. She picked up the book. She said, "You have it." He had come to the library in response to a note. She saw it in his hand, folded cream paper, the broken seal a dark red that caught the firelight. The note, he told her, had arrived through a footman he could not now identify, with a message suggesting that his presence was needed in the library on a matter requiring discretion. He had come because the wording was plausible, and because he was not, at that moment, thinking clearly enough. That was his word for it, not clearly enough. And the way he said it told Hesper that this was a significant admission. He had realised, 20 feet from the door, what the note was likely to be. He had come in anyway, because the alternative, turning back in the corridor, seemed worse. "Lady Genevieve Carstairs," he said, not as a question. Most probably, Hesper agreed. He set the note on the mantelpiece. He told her with exact economy. The door would open within the next few minutes. There would be witnesses. The only explanation for his presence in this room with a young, unmarried woman that did not ruin her outright was one that made his presence here a matter of acknowledged prior arrangement. He looked at her directly. His face was stripped at that moment of the formal distaste she had catalogued at the musicale. What was underneath it was not softer exactly, but it was more honest. An engagement, he said. Announced tonight. It leaves us both a version of the story we can defend. The fire shifted. Somewhere beyond the library wall, the gallery continued. The murmur of it audible, low and continuous, like weather. Hesper considered him. She considered the door. She considered the note on the mantelpiece with its broken seal, and she thought about Mrs. Hadlow, saying the house had not been happy at large gatherings. And she thought about the Cowper volume on the floor at her feet. And she made her decision in approximately the time it takes to exhale. Very well, she said. The door opened. Mrs. Redmond came in first. She was a widow of 40, narrow-featured, with the kind of social agility that expressed itself as perpetual forward motion. She never entered a room without already knowing what she would say when she left it. Behind her was Miss Tewkesbury, a spinster of similar age and very different manner, who loved scandal the way some women loved music. Not despite its capacity to cause distress, but partially because of it. They stopped. They took in the scene with the speed of the practiced observer. The Duke of Kelvinridge, standing near the fire. Miss Whitgrove, the dowager's companion, seated with a book on the floor at her feet. The Duke spoke before either of them could arrange their expressions into the shape of surprise. Ladies. His voice was level, almost pleasant, with nothing in it that admitted the scene required explaining. You will be among the first to hear the news, as you have arrived at a convenient moment. Miss Whitgrove has done me the honour of accepting my proposal. There was a silence of perhaps 3 seconds. Then Mrs. Redmond said, "How delightful," in the tone of a woman who has just been handed a gift she intends to assess later in private. Behind them, in the doorway, Lady Genevieve stood. She had followed them, naturally. She would not have left to chance the question of what was actually discovered in the library. Her face rearranged itself, rapidly and with considerable skill, into an expression of warmth that reached almost to her eyes. "How wonderful," she said. "I wish you every happiness." The pause before she said it was just long enough to be a sentence in itself. The news preceded them back to the gallery by the time it takes Mrs. Redmond to cover the length of a corridor at her usual velocity, which is to say, almost no time at all. Hesper walked beside the Duke. She was very aware of the Cowper volume she had left on the table. She had not picked it up again, and she thought she would not retrieve it tonight, and that it would find its way back to the shelf in some later accounting of the evening's disarrangements. She thought this because it was easier to think about the book than to think about what she had just agreed to. At a morning call 3 days later, in the drawing room of a woman neither she nor the Duke had particularly chosen, but to whom the engagement had naturally elevated her access, Hesper sat near the window with a cup of tea gone slightly cold, when Mrs. Redmond settled beside her with the smooth facility of someone who had planned the proximity. "It is such a neat arrangement," Mrs. Redmond said, pleasantly. Her tone was the social equivalent of a knife held with the blade turned slightly sideways, present, but not yet applied. "A duke in need of a season's peace, and a companion in need of a season's parties. How tidy." Hesper did not flinch. She had had 3 days to prepare for exactly this, and she had prepared for it with the same systematic care she applied to everything. She looked at Mrs. Redmond with the calm of someone who has chosen what to show and is satisfied with the choice. "All arrangements are neat," she said, "until one lives inside them." Mrs. Redmond smiled, with the expression of a woman who has received a more interesting answer than expected and intends to think about it. She moved on. Hesper set down the cold tea and looked out the window at the March street below, where a boy in a green coat was walking a spaniel on a very long lead, and the spaniel was investigating every lamppost with the concentrated enthusiasm of someone who had decided nothing would be skipped. The engagement was now a fact in every drawing room in London. What it was in private, what she and the Duke had agreed it was, in the 2 minutes before the library door opened, remained entirely another question, and one that no one had yet had occasion to ask her directly, and one she was not certain she could have answered. The Dowager was not a woman who asked permission before acting on a decision. 3 days after the morning call, where Mrs. Redmond had tried her assessment and found it returned unopened, the old woman summoned Hesper to the morning room before the chocolate tray had arrived, sat her in the chair beside the writing desk, and looked her over with the appraising directness of a general surveying uncertain terrain. "You will need clothes," she said. Hesper knew better than to argue with a statement delivered in that register. She said, "I have clothes, ma'am." "You have the grey silk and the brown wool and 2 morning dresses that have been turned once already. Those are not clothes for a future Duchess of Kelvinridge. They are clothes for someone who expects to remain invisible. And you no longer have that option." The Dowager paused. "I am not certain you regret it as much as you believe you do." Hesper did not answer that. She was not entirely sure of the answer. What followed was an education in the machinery of visible womanhood. Phelps, who had been dressing the Dowager's female relations for the better part of 3 decades and held precise views on what the human figure could accomplish under the right conditions, was applied to the problem with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She arrived in Hesper's small room one morning with a measuring tape and the focused expression of a craftsman assessing unworked material. And she did not make Hesper feel assessed so much as attended to, which was, Hesper recognised, a considerable skill. There were fittings. There was a dressmaker on Bruton Street, a French woman of compact build and devastating eye named Madame Villiers, whose workroom smelled of hot iron and chalk and the particular woolen warmth of cut cloth. Madame Villiers looked at Hesper once, turned her slowly by the shoulders with a brisk impersonality, said something under her breath that sounded like an architectural observation, and began pulling bolts of fabric from the shelves with a speed that suggested she had already decided and was merely confirming. A deep blue wool for morning visits, the colour of ink on wet paper. A cream silk for evenings, unornamented, the kind of simplicity that only works when the cut is exactly right. A pale green muslin for at-home afternoons, which Madame Villiers selected with the air of a woman making a point. "Not the grey," the Dowager said, from the chair where she had installed herself to observe. "She has been the grey long enough." The first time Hesper wore the blue wool to a morning call, she noticed, in the way one notices something that has always been true and was simply waiting to become apparent, that she still knew how to walk into a room. It had not left her. 4 years of careful smallness had pushed it down, but not erased it. It was there still. In the straightness of her back and the steadiness of her gaze, a residue of her earlier life, when her father had still been alive, and the house in Wiltshire had still been theirs, and she had still been a person with prospects, rather than a person with a position. The blue wool simply made it visible again. London watched her the way it watched everything it could not yet categorise. She was inspected at morning calls and dissected in corners at assemblies, and she bore it with the patience of someone who had spent 4 years being ignored and found scrutiny, by comparison, relatively manageable. She was not witty. She did not try to be. She was not beautiful in any way that announced itself. What she was, under examination, was consistently herself, not performing ease, but simply exercising it. And this was, to a room full of performance, somewhat disarming. A few women decided they liked her. More decided to reserve judgment. The judgment reservers watched Lady Genevieve for cues, which told Hesper a great deal about who in any given room held the weight. Lady Genevieve had not been idle. At this point, what was known was, Lady Genevieve had engineered the library trap. It had produced an engagement she had not intended, and she was now in possession of a piece of information, the truth of the arrangement's origin, that gave her considerable leverage, if she chose to use it carefully. What she also knew, through means that became apparent later, was the nature of the engagement itself. Not merely the circumstances of the library, which half of London could reconstruct by inference, but the explicit fact that it had been proposed by the Duke as a mutual convenience and accepted on those terms. This intelligence had reached her through a footman, a young man named Tom, who had been positioned outside the library door and who had, in the weeks following, clearly suffered some form of conscience. Because the same information he had sold Lady Genevieve, he later brought, in fragments and distress, to Mrs. Hadlow, who brought it to the Dowager, who said nothing about it to anyone for reasons of her own. Hesper did not know any of this yet. At Lady Somersham's dinner, in the 4th week of the engagement, she knew only that something had shifted in the quality of the room's attention toward her. A particular kind of surface warmth that indicated an underlying current running the other direction. She was seated toward the middle of the table, between a Lincolnshire baronet with strong views on drainage and a young clergyman who had not expected to be placed near the Duke's fiancée and was managing his surprise with visible effort. The dinner was pleasant, the food competent, and Hesper ate her turbot and attended to her neighbours and was, she believed, doing rather well. She slipped into the adjacent alcove afterward, during the interval before the ladies removed to the drawing-room, to retrieve the Dowager's reticule from the chair where it had been left. The alcove was separated from the dining-room by a curtain of heavy amber damask, and 2 voices reached her before she had time to announce herself. She did not know either voice by name. Young women, the pitch and cadence of recent presentations, the particular breathlessness of people conveying news they did not originate. "But you know how it came about," the first was saying. She was found alone with the Duke, and the only way to save her reputation was a hasty announcement. They had no choice. "Mrs. Redmond says not to expect a wedding." The second voice was lower, attempting discretion and not quite achieving it. "A fiction of convenience. Got up to escape the scandal." When the season is over, Hesper stood still. She had the reticule in her hand. She had picked it up without thinking, automatically, and now she stood holding it, a small beaded thing, heavy with the vinaigrette and 2 sealed letters, and the collapsible lorgnette the Dowager carried and almost never used. And she listened to the silence after the voices moved away, and she stood in it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went back to the dinner. She did not flinch. She had decided she would not flinch, standing in the alcove with the amber damask blocking the candlelight. And she kept the decision intact through the remainder of the evening, through the drawing room, through the tea, through the carriage ride home, in which the Dowager looked at her once with an expression that asked nothing and required nothing, but was, she understood, a form of company. What she did, 2 mornings later, had nothing in it of proclamation. She simply, on a grey Tuesday with rain against the windows, rearranged the morning room. The cold chaise longue that had lived against the far wall, in a position of faintly ceremonial impracticality, close to nothing, facing nothing in particular, offering a clear view of the ceiling, she moved to the alcove nearest the fire. This required displacing a small satinwood table and a brass coal scuttle, and Hesper moved them both with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, sweeping the hearthrug straight afterward, so the indentations of the original placement would not show. The formal arrangement of hothouse flowers that had occupied the centre table for as long as she had been in the house, stiff, expensive, precisely the sort of arrangement that announced the means to procure it and then became invisible, she replaced with a bowl of heather she had bought that morning from a woman selling bunches from a basket near the corner of Grafton Street. The heather was still damp from the rain, its small purple flowers exuding a faint dry sweetness that was not the smell of London. It was the smell of somewhere with less noise and more sky. The dowager came in at 11, stopped at the doorway, looked at the rearranged room, and said nothing. She crossed to the fire, settled into the chaise with the careful ease of a woman respecting her own joints, and opened her correspondence. She smiled, once, at the heather. She said nothing about it. This was, Hesper had come to understand, the highest possible form of dowager approval. The Duke came that afternoon. He visited with a regularity that had surprised Hesper. Not the frequency of courtship, not the determined frequency of a man performing for an audience, but the quieter frequency of someone who had found a room he could breathe in and returned to it with the pragmatic regularity of necessity. He spent 20 minutes with the dowager, which she used to discuss his management of the Kelvinridge estates in Devon with the authority of a woman who had managed them herself for 15 years before him and had strong opinions about drainage of her own. Then the dowager dismissed them both to the morning room with the airy authority of someone who had arranged things she declined to acknowledge arranging, and Hesper poured the tea. He noticed the heather before he sat down. He stood for a moment looking at the bowl, the way a man looks at something that has asked him a question before he has heard the question clearly. And then he looked at the chaise by the fire, and then at the blank space on the wall where the stiff, hothouse arrangement had lived. "Why did you do it?" he asked. "A room should be comfortable," Hesper said, "not correct." He was quiet. He took his tea. The rain had stopped, and the afternoon light through the cleaned windows was the thin, honest light of early March giving way to April. Not warm, not yet, but beginning to lose the quality of a refusal. "There is a library in Berkeley Square," he said after a moment, "that has not been changed in 20 years. My grandmother stopped going in after Marcus died. I have not been in it since I returned from Devon." A pause. "I went in last week, and I could not determine what was wrong with it. I think now that it is correct." That evening he was still there when the dowager retired. Hesper went to take up the reading she performed each night, correspondence first, then whatever volume the house held in nearest reach, and found him in the morning room with the fire burning lower and the heather casting a faint shadow on the wall above the bowl. He was not reading. He was looking at the fire with the particular quality of stillness she had learned to recognize as something in him that was considering whether to move or to stay as it was. He told her about Marcus on a single, long exhale, as though he had been holding it at pressure for longer than he had realized. His brother had been 31. He had been the steady one, the one who knew the names of the tenant farmers and the histories of the estate's older problems and the right moment to speak in any given conversation, which was a skill Everett had never possessed in the same way. He had died of a fever that should not have been fatal. A summer fever, the kind a man recovers from, and it had taken him in 8 days, which had not been enough time for anyone to understand what was happening until it was over. The title had come to Everett not with ceremony, but with the flat shock of something that has no instructions for how to be received. He had gone to Devon. He had closed the Berkeley Square house and gone to Devon and spent 6 months learning to be a person the estate needed and not thinking about his brother, because if he started, there was no visible end to it. And there were accounts to settle and a household to manage, and the grief, as he put it, had no convenient place to be. Hesper listened. She did not offer comfort. She had learned long ago that comfort offered too quickly is often more about the comfort giver's discomfort than the grief bearer's need. And what he was doing was not asking to be relieved of anything. He was simply, for the first time in what was evidently a long time, allowing someone to be present while he held it. When he finished, she said, "You will grieve him properly one day. It will keep until you are ready." He looked at her. The fire had dropped to embers. The room was lit now mostly by the 2 candles on the mantelpiece and the ambient grey of the street outside. His face, in that light, had the openness of a thing that has been closed a long time and has found, unexpectedly, that it remembers how not to be. "Everett," she said, using his name for the first time, without deciding to, the way one sometimes does a thing that has been true for a while before being said. He said nothing. He looked at the heather bowl on the table. The small purple flowers had opened further in the warmth of the room, and the scent of them was stronger now, faint and dry and real. She was aware, walking upstairs later, of something she could not name directly and would not have named even if she could. A shift in the interior atmosphere of herself. A quiet alteration in the arrangement of things she had believed settled. She had been very careful these past weeks to hold the engagement at the practical distance it required. It was an agreement. It had terms, if unspoken ones. It was not what it appeared to be from the outside, and she had been rigorous about not allowing herself to forget that. But rigorous was not the same as reliable, and she thought, setting her candle on the nightstand, that she was going to have to be more careful than she had been. The question of what she was going to be careful about was one she declined, for the moment, to press. The days that followed had a particular quality she did not allow herself to name while she was living inside them. She was careful, she had decided to be careful, and careful is a thing that requires constant maintenance, like a fire that produces the right amount of heat and no more. She read the correspondence and attended the morning calls and wore the blue wool and the cream silk, and stood beside the dowager at whatever occasion the dowager chose. And she was, by every observable measure, entirely composed. What she was not was unchanged. The Duke visited the morning room 3 more times in the following fortnight, once with the explicit purpose of accompanying the dowager to a portrait viewing at the Royal Academy, a visit the dowager conducted with the unsentimental efficiency of a woman assessing inventory. And twice without any particular purpose that he named. He had the quality, she noticed, of a man who had been alone for long enough that company had become a thing he sought by instinct rather than design. Arriving and staying and departing, as though the visits were simply events that occurred rather than things he had constructed. They talked. She could not have given a complete account of what was talked about. Books, occasionally, the Devon estates, their particular drainage problems, and the tenant who had been farming the North Field's worst soil for 30 years with the stubborn optimism of a man convinced the soil was being difficult on purpose. The behaviour of the Berkeley Square library fire, which drew poorly because of a chimney problem that had been noted in the household accounts, and never resolved because both Marcus and their father had found the problem interesting in the abstract and costly in the concrete. She began to know him. That was what it was. She did not examine this too closely. What she did not know, what no one had told her, and what was being quietly established in rooms she was not present in, was this. 6 weeks prior, a young footman named Tom Elwick had been persuaded, through a combination of Lady Genevieve's considerable skill at persuasion and a sum of money that represented approximately 3 months of his wages, to position himself in the corridor outside the library at the Berkeley Square ball and report the Duke's words to a representative of Lady Genevieve's household. He was 19. He was not, at heart, dishonest. He was simply young enough to mistake the availability of a justification for the justification itself. And by the time he understood what he had sold, it was already spent. Tom Elwick had gone to Mrs. Hadlow on a Thursday morning in the 4th week of the engagement. He had stood in the housekeeper's room, with his hat turning in his hands, and told her, in the halting sentences of someone whose conscience had gotten sufficiently ahead of his composure that the two could no longer pretend to be travelling together, what he had done. Mrs. Hadlow had listened. She had said nothing to Tom beyond what was strictly necessary. She had taken the information to the Dowager the same afternoon. The Dowager had said nothing to anyone, for reasons she declined to share. She was 80 years old. She played a long game. Hesper, at this point, knew none of this. Lady Genevieve had, for 6 weeks, possessed the explicit knowledge that the Duke's engagement was a mutual arrangement of convenience, offered by him as a remedy for a situation he had partially caused. She had held it until the moment she identified the best place to spend it. The Richmond Park picnic was announced by Mrs. Hartwell, a sociable woman of middle years with a particular gift for assembling the exact mix of guests most likely to produce a memorable afternoon on the last Thursday of April. The weather had turned, finally, from the long grey reluctance of the English spring into something that could be described, without irony, as pleasant, thin warmth, a sky the pale blue of old China. The grass in the park beginning to express genuine conviction. 24 guests made the journey by carriage and barouche to the indicated stretch of ground near Pembroke Lodge, where the Hartwell footman had arranged a white cloth table and an abundance of provisions, and a scattering of rugs and chairs that turned the parkland into a drawing room with a more ambitious ceiling. Hesper arrived with the Dowager, who had come for an hour only and intended to use the hour for the specific pleasure of sitting in the open air without social obligation.
They settled near a stand of birch trees that stood at the edge of the arranged space, their leaves in the new coin green of early May. And Hesper poured the Dowager's tea from the flask Phelps had packed in the basket and watched the afternoon organise itself. Lady Genevieve was present in the pale gold muslin that suited her extremely well, and that she had not, Hesper would have wagered, selected without consideration of the setting. She moved through the picnic with her usual beautiful precision, arriving at clusters of conversation and departing them with the timing of someone who understood that an entrance is only as effective as the exit that frames it. She did not approach Hesper. She did not need to. Hesper was standing 20 feet away, near the birch trees when it happened. She could not see Lady Genevieve's face. She was looking at the bark of the nearest birch, where some previous visitor to the park had carved initials in the old way, 2 letters inside a rough heart, the scar of it grown smooth and pale over however many years it had been there. She was considering the initials, WF, and another set below, too faded to read, when the voices reached her, carried on the open air with the complete fidelity of a still afternoon. Lady Genevieve, to a cluster of 3 women 20 feet to her left, speaking in the carrying near whisper of someone who wants their discretion to be observed without wanting their content to be inaudible. "You know I would never say a word against her. She is clearly very capable. But the companion found him alone on purpose. She laid the trap herself. The library, the note, all of it. He could hardly refuse to offer for her afterward, could he? A gentleman in that position." The birch bark was very smooth under her fingers. She stood still. She took a full inventory of what she was hearing and held it at a careful distance from anything immediate. The women receiving this information made small sounds of the appropriate register: surprise, concern, the low, pleasurable distress of people receiving intelligence that reorganises a story they had already found interesting. Hesper recognised 2 of the 3 voices. Mrs. Hartwell's daughter, who had more warmth than discernment, and the woman she knew as Mrs. Selby, who had both and would therefore know exactly what to do with the information by nightfall. She turned from the birch tree. She crossed back to the Dowager, poured her a second cup from the flask, and said nothing. The Dowager looked at her once,
with the particular quality of attention she had learned to recognize as the old woman choosing to wait, and then return to her own thoughts. The news, once released on a calm afternoon in Richmond Park, moved through London society with the efficiency of weather. Hesper tracked it by the quality of the rooms she entered over the following 3 days. The particular kind of warmth that has a reservation in it, the way certain conversations ceased by a degree rather than entirely when she approached. The single occasion at a Thursday call when a woman she knew slightly said, with elaborate casualness, that it was remarkable how quickly these arrangements came about, wasn't it? The engagement having seemed very sudden. And looked at Hesper with the expression of someone who has asked a question while pretending to make a remark. She bore it. She had been bearing things for 4 years with a competence that did not require admiration and did not receive it. What she found she could not easily bear was the other part, not the attack on herself. She had sufficient clarity about her own situation to understand that what Lady Genevieve was weaponizing was a near truth, and near truths were among the most durable weapons available, precisely because they required no invention. What she could not bear was the image of it landing on him. The Duke had proposed the engagement himself. That fact was simply not accessible to the public version of the story, and in its absence, the rumour reversed the entire architecture of the event. It made him the object of a scheme rather than the author of a solution. It stripped him of the only honest part of that night, which was that he had been the one to offer it, and she had only agreed. He would not say so publicly. She understood why. Saying so would require describing what the note was and what he had walked into, which would implicate Lady Genevieve directly and produce a scandal of a different kind, one that a gentleman of his position would prefer to absorb himself rather than escalate. He would say nothing, and the story would sit, and every week of the season remaining it would calcify a little further into what people believed. She went to him on the Friday afternoon, before the grand ball that would close the season on Saturday. The house in Berkeley Square received her in the large downstairs sitting room, not the library, which she had not entered since the ball, and which sat at the end of the corridor with the closed-door quality of a place that had seen too much to be neutral. He was standing near the window when she came in, not looking at anything in particular outside. The square was damp with the previous night's rain, the plane trees just past their best flowering, a cab horse standing at the corner with the patient eloquence of an animal long past irritability. On the writing desk behind him, she noticed, almost without meaning to, a small leather case, dark green, fitted, the kind that is made for a single purpose and carries that purpose in its proportions without needing to be opened. She had seen similar cases in jewellers' windows on Bond Street. She understood, in the instant of seeing it, what it meant, and understood also that she had arrived with what she came to say, and would say it regardless. What Everett already knew, and had known since the library evening when she had called him by his name and the fire had dropped to embers, that the arrangement had long since become something other than what it had begun as, and that he intended to propose truly at the ball, in whatever form that truth could be made decent and clear. He had not told her this. He had told no one. The leather case on the desk had arrived from the jeweller that morning. Hesper did not know this. She knew the case, and she knew its shape, and she looked away from it. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the arrangement." He turned from the window. She told him without decoration, because she did not have it in her to dress it as anything other than what it was. The season was ending. The rumour had done what it had been designed to do. If they ended the engagement now, the story Lady Genevieve had constructed would settle into the version people chose. Companion entrapment, convenient fiction. But it would settle at the end of a season, when drawing rooms dispersed to the country and the whole machinery of scrutiny relaxed into something more easily survived. If they waited, the story would follow into autumn. It would follow into the year. She said she wished to release him from it. She said it was the right thing. Her voice, through all of this, was entirely steady. She had prepared it. She was wearing the blue wool, which she had put on that morning for reasons she had not examined, and she stood in it with her back straight and her hands at her sides. And she said what she had come to say, and she meant every word of it. And her reasons were all the reasons she had stated, and she was also lying by omission in a way she could not help and would not have named. He was very still. Then he turned to the window. "Very well," he said. 2 words. The exact words she had said in the library when he had proposed the arrangement. And she felt the echo of them as though the room's walls had returned it. 2 small syllables that had built something and were now dismantling it with the same minimal equipment. His voice had the quality she had catalogued at the musicale the first time she had seen him. The shut door quality, the surface of a thing that has closed itself and does not intend to explain why. She had expected argument. She was not sure what she had expected. She had not expected the complete, immediate, cold assent. And she stood for a moment in the particular stillness of having received exactly what she asked for, which is sometimes the worst thing. "The announcement can be made after the ball," she said. "I thought to avoid—" "After the ball," he agreed, to the window. There was nothing else to say. She went. The cab horse was still at the corner when she came out of the house, and into the square's thin afternoon light, standing with the same patient stillness. And she walked past it, and around the corner, and did not look back, which was also a decision she had prepared. In the sitting room, the Duke stood at the window long enough that the light changed. He did not look at the desk. He had turned to the window because turning away had been the only response his body could produce that did not reveal something he had no right to require her to receive. And he stood in it until the distance between what he had intended and what had just happened had become a fixed fact rather than a new one. The leather case sat on the desk in the darkening room, closed, its purpose unspent. The ball was tomorrow, and Lady Genevieve's work was apparently done. And the question of what could be salvaged from a situation in which both parties had done exactly what the other party had offered them permission to do was not, at that moment, a question either of them could see the answer to. The ball was at 9. Hesper knew, as she descended the stairs of the Grosvenor Street house at 8:30, in the cream silk that Phelps had laid out with the wordless authority of a woman who had made her decision and saw no point in discussing it, that she would be returning to these stairs before midnight, as a person with a different future than the one she currently carried. She had spent the previous evening in the small chair by her window, not reading, the Cowper history open on her lap to a page about a demolished orangery in Shropshire, whose owner had pulled it down to build something more modern and regretted it for the remainder of his life. She had read the same paragraph 4 times without retaining a word of it, and then she had closed the book and sat in the dark for a while, which was more honest. Phelps had dressed her in silence, which was unusual. Phelps had opinions on most things and expressed them with the economy of someone who had learned that precision was more efficient than elaboration, and her silences were therefore pointed. The cream silk fell straight and clean, the cut Madame Villiers had designed with the precision of an argument. Nothing added that was not necessary, nothing removed that was not cost. Her hair was done simply, the only ornament a pair of small garnets that had been the dowager's and were now, the dowager had announced one morning without ceremony, Hesper's. She had not argued. She had put them on and said nothing, which the dowager had accepted as the appropriate response. Before she left the room, she opened the drawer of the nightstand. The small velvet case, the one that had held her mother's pearl earrings, sold 4 years ago to a jeweller on Milsom Street who had given her a fair price and not commented on the circumstances, was where it had always been, under the corner of the spare candle. She picked it up, turned it once in her hands, set it back. It was still empty. She had always known it was empty. She was not entirely certain what she was checking. The dowager was waiting in the hall in the silver-grey silk, Phelps having completed some architectural achievement with the backdressing that had taken the better part of an hour. She looked at Hesper with the expression she used when she had formed a view some time ago and was simply waiting for events to confirm it. "You look well," she said, which, from the dowager, constituted an essay. They did not speak in the carriage. The streets were full, half of London moving in the same direction, the lanterns of other carriages making a bright procession in the Berkeley Square end of things, the sound of hooves on damp stone and the occasional command of a coachman carrying in the cool May air. Hesper looked out the window at the lit facades passing and thought about nothing in particular, which took considerable effort. Before the gallery's events can be understood, before any part of what followed can be understood, the positions of the pieces must be stated plainly. Lady Genevieve Carstairs arrived at the ball knowing the following: that the engagement between the Duke of Kelvinridge and Miss Whitgrove had been proposed by the Duke as a mutual arrangement of convenience, in the library, to escape the trap Lady Genevieve had laid. She knew the exact words he had used, because Tom Elwick, stationed in the corridor, had heard enough to make the substance clear. She had held this intelligence for 6 weeks, and she had spent it once at Richmond Park, and the expenditure had produced what she intended. Hesper had gone to the Duke and ended it herself. What Lady Genevieve did not know was that the Duke had intended to propose truly at this ball, or that Mrs. Hadlow had taken Tom Elwick's confession to the Dowager, or that the Dowager had chosen to hold the information and wait. The Duke arrived knowing the following: that the engagement was ended, by Hesper's request, as of yesterday afternoon, that he had agreed to it, that the announcement would follow tonight's ball. He did not know that Hesper had inferred the contents of the green leather case, which remained on the desk in the Berkeley Square sitting room, closed. Hesper arrived knowing what she had said and what he had answered, and nothing else. Tom Elwick stood at the door in white gloves and the Kelvinridge livery, taking cloaks and directing guests with the trained composure of a footman at a large function. When Hesper passed him, the Dowager ahead, Hesper a step behind, his eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. He was 19, and whatever else he was not able to conceal from his face that he knew exactly what his information had been used to build. She did not know yet the full extent of it, but she saw the look, and she filed it away with everything else. The gallery was transformed. At the first ball of the season, the Berkeley Square house had been newly opened, its atmosphere still carrying the slight displacement of a place recalled to habitation from long quiet. Now, 10 weeks later, the rooms had been lived in, however slightly. Small things had shifted. Our rug had been replaced. The western window's drape had been adjusted by some practical hand. The library fire had been repaired and drew cleanly now. The gallery itself was full, candlelight running the full length of it from 12 sconces, the parquet floor reflecting it in long amber stripes between the couples moving through the opening set. The musicians, 4 of them in the alcove at the north end, were producing a sound that was pleasant and competent without demanding attention. The kind of music that holds a room's temperature rather than changing it. The Duke was present. She located him in the first minutes without intending to. He was near the far wall, speaking with Lord Hartwell and a man she did not know, his evening coat a deep charcoal that absorbed the candlelight rather than returning it, the white of his cravat the only bright thing about him. He had not yet seen her, or if he had, he gave no indication. This was, she understood, the agreement. They would behave as themselves until the announcement could be made, and they would not make it awkward in the interval by performing more than their ordinary social functions required. She had not known ordinary social functions could be quite this taxing. She stood beside the Dowager and exchanged civilities with 3 women she had come to know over the course of the season. And she drank a glass of lemonade she did not want. And she watched the dancing with the practiced attention of someone locating their centre of gravity in the known landscape of observation. Lady Genevieve, in white silk with a single strand of pearls, and the expression of a woman who has arrived at a predetermined destination and is simply allowing the clock to run, drifted through the first hour with her usual unhurried precision. She danced once with a viscount. She spoke at length with Mrs. Redmond, who received whatever was said with an attentive tilt of the head. She did not approach Hesper. Hesper watched, and understood that the timing was the instrument. The set changed. The gallery reconfigured itself as it did between dances, couples dispersing, new groupings forming, a general drift toward the refreshment room at the north end and back. The dowager had been claimed by 2 ancient allies and installed near the fire with the visible satisfaction of a woman who had arrived at exactly the gathering she intended. The night was at its peak density, the hour between 10 and 11 when a ball is fullest and loudest and most itself, every conversation competing with every other, the candles at their brightest before the late evening drop. Lady Genevieve moved to the centre of the gallery. It was not a dramatic positioning, it did not need to be. She simply placed herself at the room's natural focal point, in the way she placed herself everywhere. And then, she spoke to the woman beside her, in a tone precisely calculated to carry in the current lull between pieces. "I am so glad the season has ended happily," she said. The voice was sweet and full of warmth, and carried 10 feet in every direction as easily as though she had designed the room for the purpose. "Though, I do hope dear Miss Whitgrove is not distressed by any of the unkind talk. The story about the engagement being merely a convenient fiction meant to be ended. I think it has been greatly exaggerated. I am sure it has." The gallery did not go silent all at once. It went silent in the way a fire goes out. From the edges inward, the conversations nearest her extinguishing first, then the next ring, then the one beyond, until the space between the music's ending and whatever came next was occupied only by the ambient crackle of 30 people not speaking. Hesper was 15 feet to Lady Genevieve's left, near the second sconce from the south end. She felt the silence arrive rather than heard it, a change in the air's pressure, the room becoming attentive to itself in a way it had not been a moment before. She understood exactly what had been said, and why it had been said in that particular way. The sweetness of the concern performing the attack, so that the attack could not be named. She understood that the room was waiting. She understood that the only available response was a true one. She opened her mouth. She had prepared nothing. Because there was nothing to prepare. There was only the truth, which was that the engagement had been a convenience, and that Lady Genevieve was entirely correct, and that it was ending, and that everything that had grown between its convenient walls over the course of the season was something she had no right to name and no public language for, and would have to carry back to Grosvenor Street and fold away in the drawer beside the empty velvet case, like the clothes of someone who had gone and would not. He was moving. She saw it before she understood what she was seeing, a change in the room's geometry, the particular disturbance of a large space when one person in it has made a decision that reorganizes everything around them. He crossed the gallery the way he had crossed Lady Southerton's musicale 3 months ago. Not drifting, not circling, not performing the movement for the benefit of observers. Directly, with the flat and total purposefulness of a man who has stopped calculating the cost of a thing and is simply doing it. He stopped in front of her. He took her hand. Not a bow, not a formal offer of assistance. He simply took her hand, her right hand, in both of his,
and held it with the certainty of someone who has held something carefully for a long time and has decided that careful is not the same as right. It was the first time they had ever touched, and she felt it with a clarity that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the specific, grounding solidity of another person's hands choosing to hold yours in a public room. He turned to the gallery. His voice, when he spoke, was the voice she had heard in the Berkeley Square library when he told her about Marcus. Not the voice for rooms, not the social instrument of correct courtesy, but the flatter, older voice that did not perform. "Miss Whitgrove and I," he said, "arrived at our engagement through circumstances that were not conventional. That is true, and I will not pretend otherwise. The arrangement, when it began, was one of mutual convenience." He paused one beat, not for effect, but because what came next was not easy. "It has not remained one. On my part." The room held. Somewhere in the far alcove, a musician shifted and produced a single, unintentional note that no one acknowledged. "I should like it to be real," he said. And then he turned, and the face he turned to her was the face from the library firelight. Stripped of the shut door quality, stripped of the careful social surface, stripped of everything he had been managing for the better part of a year, under the weight of a title that had arrived on him like a roof coming down. What was underneath was not uncomplicated, and it was not without the marks of what it had cost to arrive here. And it was entirely, without any performance whatsoever, his. "Miss Whitgrove." His voice dropped, just slightly, so the words were still audible to the nearest part of the room, but were addressed to her and no one else. "Hesper, will you marry me, of your own choice, with nothing forcing it, now that the convenience has been removed?" The gallery waited. The candles in the nearest sconce threw his shadow long across the parquet floor. His hands were still holding hers, and she could feel the slight unevenness of his grip. Not nerves exactly, but the physical evidence of a question that had been asked in earnest and was not certain of its answer. She looked at him. She looked at the face she had been learning since March, the hard, honest geography of it, the March sea eyes that had stopped being weary and were now something she did not yet have the right word for, but suspected she would, given time. She thought of the Cowper volume on the library floor. She thought of the heather bowl filling the morning room with the smell of somewhere with less noise and more sky. She thought of the name she had said in the firelight, once, without deciding to, because it had simply been true. She had an answer ready. It was exact and specific, and it named the thing she had not named aloud before, and she drew breath to give it. "Yes," she said, "because I have loved you since the evening you told me your brother's name." Her voice was entirely steady. She had not planned those exact words, but they arrived with the specificity of a thing that has been true for long enough to have found its shape, and she gave them without flinching. In a room of 30 people who were close enough to hear them, and she did not look at the room while she said them, she looked at him. His hands tightened on hers. Not a dramatic grip, the small, involuntary tightening of a thing held carefully that has just discovered it does not have to be held carefully anymore. Something crossed his face. Not the structural possibility of a smile she had catalogued at the musicale, but the actual thing, brief and unguarded, there and gone in the time it takes a candle flame to recover from a draught. Then he inclined his head, just slightly, the fraction of a formal bow turned private. A gesture that had been stripped of its social function and given an entirely different one. "Then we are agreed," he said. And the 3 words had in them the dry, precise warmth that she had come to understand was how he expressed everything he could not find a larger language for. The gallery found its voice again. It did not erupt in the sudden way of a theatrical audience. It recovered in the layered, graduated way of a room full of people who have witnessed something they will not finish processing for several days. The nearest cluster broke first. A woman Hesper knew by sight pressed her hand and said something whose words she could not afterward reconstruct. A man clapped the Duke on the shoulder, with the slightly over-emphatic warmth of someone who has been caught by surprise and is compensating. The musicians in the north alcove, who had been watching over their instruments with the attentive disengagement of people professionally required to be present without participating, conferred briefly and then began to play. A clean, simple country dance, the kind that fills a room without requiring anything of it. Mrs. Redmond, standing near the second window, received the news with the expression of a woman recalibrating an entire season's understanding in real time. She was not a cruel person precisely. She was a person who had been working with the information available to her and was now in possession of considerably more. She crossed to Hesper within 3 minutes and offered her congratulations with a warmth that was, Hesper judged, mostly genuine and only partially compensatory, which was a more favourable ratio than she had expected. Miss Tewkesbury, who had been near the refreshment table, went absolutely still for a moment, in the manner of a person whose love of scandal has just been tested by the discovery that the most scandalous outcome, a genuine public proposal, freely given and freely accepted, in full view of 30 witnesses, is also the most affecting one, and that she did not know what to do with being affected. She rallied. She pressed forward. She told Hesper, with the emphatic sincerity of someone who has surprised themselves, that she could not be more pleased. And she looked as though she might, in fact, mean it. The dowager, when Hesper reached her through the press of people, was sitting in exactly the same position near the fire as she had been before any of it began, with the composed stillness of a woman who had known the board and had been waiting for the pieces to find their places without assistance. She looked at Hesper. She looked at Everett, who had arrived a step behind. She took in the pair of them with a single surveying glance and then said to no one in particular, "Well, that took the season." Everett said, "It did." The dowager nodded with the satisfaction of an 80-year-old woman who has outlived enough people to know that satisfaction is worth acknowledging when it arrives. Lady Genevieve was gone. Hesper saw it only afterward, when the gallery had reorganised itself into the ordinary happiness of a ball at which good news has occurred, and everyone is disposed to feel the warmth of it. A gap in the room. A space near the centre where the white silk had been, and was no longer. She had gone without a scene, without a formal departure, without any of the visible mechanics of a retreat. One moment she had been present. The next, the room did not contain her. This was, Hesper thought, the most correctly done thing Lady Genevieve had accomplished all season. To understand when a position was untenable and to vacate it before it became something worse. She left London within the week for a family estate in Northumberland, and that particular space in every morning room of Mayfair closed over her absence with the speed of water filling a shape. It was the morning after the ball when Tom Elwick came to find her. He was waiting in the servants' corridor of the Berkeley Square house when Hesper arrived to confer with Mrs. Hadlow about the arrangements for removing the dowager's chaise, the visit that would happen every few days now, she supposed, until she was no longer a visitor to this house, but something else entirely. He was in his working livery, his hat in his hands as before, but his face was different from the face she had glimpsed in the doorway the previous night. That face had been the face of a boy carrying something heavy. This face was the face of a boy who has set the thing down and is still adjusting to its absence. "I want to tell you myself," he said, "what I did." She looked at him. He was 19, with red ears and the kind of directness that comes not from confidence, but from having decided that the indirect path was worse. "Mrs. Hadlow has told me the substance of it," she said. "I know. But I want you to hear it from me, Miss Whitgrove.
He said her name with particular care, as though using it correctly were a form of restitution. She paid me 3 months' wages. I told myself it wasn't the worst thing, because he would still have offered for you, but that was... He stopped. It was a lie, I told myself. She considered him for a moment. The corridor was narrow, with the morning light coming in from the kitchen garden window at an angle, and it caught the dust moving in the air between them in a way that made the ordinary dimensions of the space very precise and clear. It caused a great deal of trouble, she said. And it might have caused more. You know that. Yes, ma'am. Are you still in the Duke's employ? For now. I don't know if... I will speak to Mrs. Hadlow. She looked at him steadily. You came this morning and told me yourself. That is not nothing. He nodded, once, with the gravity of someone receiving an assessment rather than a pardon, and stood aside to let her pass. She heard him, as she went down the corridor, let out a long, slow breath that had been held for what sounded like approximately 6 weeks. The season ended, as it always did, with the particular suddenness of a collective decision. 1 week the drawing rooms were full, the next they were half-staffed. And then London dispersed to the country like a tide going out, leaving behind the quieter city of those who remained by necessity or preference. The Berkeley Square house did not close. This was noted by those who noted such things as significant. The Duke stayed in town. Hesper stayed in Grosvenor Street, which was still where she lived, and would remain so until the bans and the settlements and the arrangements produced a date, which the solicitors were attending to with the methodical efficiency of men who are good at their work and aware that their work is not the most important thing currently in progress. She visited Berkeley Square most afternoons. The visits had a new quality, not the quality of the engagement period visits with their ambient awareness of an arrangement that was and was not what it appeared, but the quieter, more specific quality of two people who have admitted what they are to each other and are learning what that means in the ordinary daylight hours. They talked differently, now that the care of concealment was removed. He showed her the household accounts for the Devon estate. Not because she asked, but because he had been managing them alone for a year, and had formed the habit of thinking through problems aloud, to no one. And she was now available to be the someone. She had good opinions about the Northfields tenant. He told her she was right about the chaise longue placement in the morning room, and that he intended to apply the principle to 3 other rooms in the house. And she said she would want to see the rooms first, which he took as the agreement it was. The library, she noted on her 3rd visit, now drew properly. The chimney problem, unresolved since the time of the previous Duke, had been attended to. New flashing at the stack. A small adjustment to the throat of the flue. The whole correction completed in an afternoon by a man from a firm in St. James's who had, according to Mrs. Hadlow, looked at it for 4 minutes and immediately identified what 30 years of household accounts had merely described. The fire burned clean and steady. The leather armchairs sat at their angle near the hearth, and the Cowper volume had been retrieved from the table and returned to the shelf. She found it by its faded spine. 3rd shelf from the bottom, in a section that held mostly 18th century poetry, in editions that had been read rather than displayed. She took it down and looked at the page she had been reading when he woke her, the night of the first ball, and the words resolved themselves this time without effort. The demolished orangery was a different demolished orangery from the Shropshire one in the other history, and she had been confusing 2 separate volumes for 6 weeks, and this discovery made her laugh. Quietly, to herself, in the library alone, which was the kind of small private happiness that has no audience and requires none. The dining room had been remade in the 3rd week of May. The table in the Berkeley Square dining room was a piece of considerable distinction, mahogany, with 2 extra leaves that could extend it to seat 24, a length appropriate to the formal entertaining its original owners had considered the primary purpose of the room. At its full extension, it occupied the space with the authority of furniture that has not been asked whether it wants to be there. For the past year, it had been set at its full length, even for the Duke's solitary meals, because no one had thought to question it, and because the footman had been trained to a standard that did not include noticing when a standard was wrong. It was Everett who had it shortened. He did not mention it to her beforehand. He simply had it done, one Tuesday. And when she arrived on the Wednesday afternoon, she passed the dining room door, which stood open, and stopped. The leaves had been removed. The table now sat at perhaps a third of its former length, positioned closer to the south windows, where the light came in from the square in the late afternoon. Not the centre of the room, where it had lived by institutional habit, but the comfortable end, near the windows and the small fireplace that in the larger arrangement had been too distant to provide any warmth to anyone seated at the table. 2 chairs. The good linen laid for supper. In the centre, in a low glass vase she did not recognise, a small bunch of heather, purple-grey, slightly dusty, the small flowers tightly clustered that exhaled its dry upland smell into the quiet afternoon room. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He came up behind her. She heard his step in the corridor, the particular sound of it she had learned over months of listening to arrivals and departures in various houses where she had stood at the edge of rooms, and stopped beside her, looking at what she was looking at. "The housekeeper at the Devon estate sends things up," he said. "The heather was in the last parcel. I thought—" he paused. "I thought it should go somewhere it would be noticed." The table was set for 2. The chairs were close together, not touching, not arranged with any deliberate intimacy, but the honest proximity of a table sized for the people who would actually sit at it, in a room now organised around comfort rather than correct. The heather stood in its glass vase between the candlesticks, and the late light from the south windows came across it at an angle that lit the small flowers individually, each one distinct, like something brought down from a hillside, and still carrying the particular temperature of where it had grown. He reached across, not looking at her, and touched her hand, his fingers settling over hers on the doorframe, with the same certainty as the night before in the gallery, unhurried and without question.